So this video was requested by Sir Matthew of Lind, who I believe has been a long-time subscriber of mine. In any event, thank you for the generous donation. And he asked me to cover the topic of Futhark, more commonly known as Germanic runes. Not to be confused with ruins. This is often a mispronunciation. Runes and ruins. And I have talked about runes to a certain extent in a previous video, but I wanted to go in, obviously, in more depth, specifically on the topic of runes. Now, the term rune itself harks back to a Proto-Germanic word that means hidden or secret, and it implies magic, that sort of thing. And there's actually a division, or a distinct branch of Germanic linguistics called aptly Runology that covers the subject. Basically, Runology involves the study and analysis of Germanic runes, and it is a distinct branch of the field of Germanic linguistics. And whilst we know a fair bit about runes, a lot remains mysterious. So let's get to the basics. Now, the actual term Futhark, which is a very common way to describe Germanic runes, simply stems from the 6 initial sounds, or the phonemes, of the Germanic rune system. The F, the U, the U, the TH, the A, the A, the R, the R, and the K, or the K. And there are a total of 24, but let's just go over the first 6, because each rune has an implicit meaning. It's important to remember that Germanic runes are not what one could call a fully fledged alphabet. They're not graphemes, that is, written characters that represent phoneme sounds, so much as they represent entire words. And for this reason, a lot is required in terms of interpreting what they say. And it's not that difficult to decipher for experts, for scholars, but each of these sounds, each of these runes rather than letters, corresponds to something. So for example, the F corresponds to cattle or wealth, and oftentimes in ancient times cattle was attributed to wealth or was associated with wealth. And for those of you who know German, you can recognize this in the German word Vieh. Right? Vieh is essentially the same word going back to Proto-Germanic, the ancient Germanic mother language. And then you have the U sound, the U, which refers to an oryx. For those who don't know, an oryx is a wild ox. TH refers to the god Thor, or even more commonly, a giant. And if you look at some of the Old Norse writings, particularly the Edda, which talks a lot about Norse mythology, or you see the giants there are referred to as Thurs. A very common way of talking about the giants of Jotun. And then you have the A, which refers to the Aesir. And the Aesir, those you may or may not be familiar, that's the principal pantheon of Germanic gods. Gods such as Odin or Wotan, or depending on which branch of Germanic tribes, Thor or Thunor. Amongst the Old English people, he was known as Thunor, Heimdall, and so on and so forth. These are all the traditional Germanic gods. R, which unsurprisingly corresponds to ride or journey, and then, at least in the first initial 6 runes, the Ka, the K, and nobody really knows what the etymology is. So, and all these sounds correspond to a greater meaning. And this is why when you're reading off Germanic runes, it's not just as if you're reading off an alphabet. You have a paragraph, and here you have letters representing things. That's not how it works. These were all inscriptions. One major difference between runes and an actual alphabet is there's no literature proper written in runes. All we have on hand are these inscriptions on various artifacts. And there are a significant number of them. Most of them are concentrated in Scandinavia. The most populous area, in terms of ruins at least, is actually Sweden, modern Sweden. You find a lot in Denmark, some in Norway. You also find a somewhat smaller number of the continent, places such as modern Germany, Holland, and of course in the United Kingdom, the now United Kingdom, Britain. But that was a later development, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And this is very common, by the way, for these runes to mean these sort of simple, common terms, animals, gods, plants. There's one rune that refers to the yew tree, for example. And this is also why this is a sort of a semi-alphabetic system rather than an alphabetic writing system proper. And the origins of Germanic runes, or Futhark, are somewhat controversial, and it's a problem basically that in terms of determining the origins, that every historian has issues with regards to almost every subject. Sparse evidence. So much has been lost to the mists of time. Now, one thing people generally do agree on is that, unlike a lot of written systems, which in the West at least, which came into existence by way of Greek, for example, the Gothic alphabet. For those of you who may not know, there was a Gothic people, and one bishop, Ulfr, he developed a written system called the Gothic alphabet, and there's actually a fair amount of written material consisting primarily of the New Testament, written in Gothic, and he did all this in the 4th century. Now you could say, well, maybe the Germanic runes, the Futhark, come from the Greek alphabet, the Hellenic alphabet, but that can't be because we have inscriptions dating back to maybe even 150 AD. So Futhark predates whatever Hellenic influence might have been. Now, the more common theory is that it stems from the Old Italic scripts. Now, Old Italic is simply a descriptor for different kinds of, this is a really simplified way of putting it, Romanized alphabets. And the Roman alphabet was originally developed by way of the Phoenician alphabet, and throughout the Italian peninsula, different variations of this alphabet arose. There was Etruscan, which no one has been able to decipher. It's not related to anything we know. Latin, you've heard of Latin. And this particular script, whether it's the Latin one, this Etruscan, this Old Italic one, is most likely the progenitor script for the shapes and the written form of Futhark. And why do scholars think this? They think this because it makes sense. For one, we have historical evidence, written evidence, as well as other evidence in terms of artifacts and archaeology to back up the idea that they got it from, say, the Romans, because we know that there was conflict, there was military conflict between the Germanic peoples and the Romans, and not only that, there was recruitment. Germanic mercenary service within the Roman armies was common, and starting from pretty much the 1st century BC onwards until the collapse of the Roman Empire. So it's quite possible that either in the 1st century BC or maybe even AD, 2nd century AD, somewhere within that range, Germanic mercenaries, people came into contact with Roman writing, picked it up from there, and kind of imported it and then stylized it in their own manner to fit the Germanic language, whichever Germanic languages they might have spoken at the time. This is the general consensus, is the origins of Futhark, but it's still unknown. Now, if you were to ask someone maybe 1,500 years ago, a Germanic person, what the origins of Futhark were, they'd certainly say Odin. And Odin, there's a poem, part of the poetic Edda, rather, called the Havamal, or in modern Icelandic, the Hovamal. And it's stated in this clearly that Odin cast divinations using these runes, and Odin sort of taught the Germanic people, or the Vikings in this case, the use of runes for the purposes of divination and understanding the mystical. This seems rather unlikely to me. But as I said, there's no record of actual literature. What we have basically are a series of descriptions. I mean, or rather inscriptions. You have a lot of minor artifacts, combs, spearheads, sword hilts, with really sparse inscriptions or writing, if you want to even call it that. You have initials for names and what have you. Two very prominent artifacts are the golden horn of Gallius. This was discovered, if I recall correctly, in the 18th century in modern Denmark, I believe near Jutland. And it's this golden horn of Gallius, and you can see here, very, very fine piece of jewelry or ornamentation. And there are inscriptions there that actually are pretty valuable because they've helped scholars decipher what Proto-Norse might have looked like. Now, I keep on talking about this proto-this, proto-that. In the comparative linguistic tradition, a language which gave birth or splintered off later into several groups of languages is referred to as a proto-language. And so there is a Proto-Norse, a Proto-English, a Proto-German, so on and so forth. And you go further and further back. Remember that chart that I was showing you in the that I posted basically as the image from my video on the evolution of language, and you'll see you have these divisions. And so you have Proto-Norse, but if you go further back, you have Proto-North Germanic. If you go even further back, you have Proto-Germanic, and the further you go back, you'll get to the original language, which would be Proto-Indo-European. So this is what I mean by Proto. In this case, this golden horn of Gallius clearly has what we would call Proto-Norse. It's that old. It's probably it dates about 400 AD, and Proto-Norse was still an intact, somewhat unified language back then, until it split off later into different branches of Old Norse, where you get Western Old Norse and Eastern Old Norse and so on and so forth. The other thing you have is the Franks casket, which is a very elaborate piece of ornamentation, as you can see, probably carved out of whalebone, very, very intricately done. Much, much later, I believe, maybe earliest 8th century, probably not much later, not much earlier than that, early 8th century, and completed within the realm of Britannia, and of course having a somewhat different origin in this regard. Now, as Futhark spread throughout the continent, you ended up with differences. When the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes left their homeland in northern Germany and Denmark, and ended up in the United Kingdom, I keep saying United Kingdom doesn't exist now, but in Great Britain, Britannia, in Britain, they brought with them this system, and they kind of developed their own variation of it. And to some extent, this is called Younger Futhark, and of course, there's Younger Futhark that was made and inscribed in Scandinavia as well. But the Anglo-Saxons, of course, created their own variation of that, and it differs slightly from what you could find in, say, the Scandinavian variety as well as the continental variety. Now, eventually, as I said, Futhark, or the rune system, never really made it into a comprehensive writing system. And it persisted in use, at least, until probably the 15th century to some degree. I mean, certainly well into the so-called High Middle Ages, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th centuries. But by then, you also have actual writing. In fact, you probably, at least in the case of Britain, with regards to Old English, the Anglo-Saxon tribes, you probably have a sort of coterminous existence of Futhark and writing to a certain extent, starting from the 8th century, and after that, slowly supplanted by the written system. Now, one interesting thing that remains the legacy of Futhark is this unique letter that you see in Old English and Old Norse and in modern Icelandic still, that we call thorn. And this simply is the th sound, the th sound. And in modern English, we've given it up. It's not a single consonant, but rather the combination of t and h. But in Old English, that's what you see, as you can see here. When it's in an initial position, it looks like that. And when it's in what we call a intermediate vocalic position, that is between vowels, it looks like that, or at the end of a word. And that legacy is one from Futhark, because that can be derived originally from the th sound in Futhark. Otherwise, the Roman alphabet, pretty much supplanted what was Futhark in its entirety, and certainly as a written system. The only thing that remains, or had remained, was that letter, and that still remains in modern Icelandic. Modern Icelandic is characteristically archaic, and this is a very common. It's part of the Icelandic alphabet, the thorn sound. And though I probably could go into more detail, this is really, in a nutshell, what Germanic runes were. They were probably imports, some kind of modification of a Roman writing system that was used for the purposes of inscription, probably for the purposes of divination, as well as magic, and to the extent that people believed in that. But I also want to talk a little bit about the sort of modern revival of Futhark. Now, interestingly enough, in the 18th century, the late 18th century, particularly in the early 19th century, you have these literary periods, are described as literary periods. The Romantic period, which was a rejection of what's regarded as the cold, calculated rationality of the earlier 18th century and the late 17th century, the Enlightenment. And so there was a lot of rekindled interest in the Germanic traditions, the sagas, the Germanic sagas, things like Havamál that I mentioned, the Edda, Beowulf, all that kind of stuff, as well as the runes. The runes once again resurfaced as a study of interest, and I think it was, in fact, in the late 18th century that formally this branch of study, runology, actually became something that people could delve into in a somewhat official sense. And this went on for quite some time in the 19th century. This interest in, we could call it classic Germanic religion and literature, and of course runes. And unsurprisingly, in their bid for power, the German Nazis later on had the Schutzstaffel, for example, took a lot of its inspiration. The symbolism, at least, is in part inspired. If you ever looked at the Schutzstaffel's insignia, that is at least partially inspired by Germanic runes. And more recently, there is this trend in Germanic neo-paganism. Some of you might have heard of it, asatru, which quite simply means, true is belief in Old Norse or in modern Icelandic as well, and the asatru is belief in the gods. The asa, the Aesir are the gods. And for whatever reason, this has been going on for about 20, 30 plus years. There are a number of people who apparently are Germanic neo-pagans, high concentrations of them in Scandinavia, understandably, some in Germany, many in the United States as well as Canada. And yes, they've revived the runic tradition too. I mean, I don't know how much of that people actually believe. I mean, I find it very difficult to believe that people would actively engage in Germanic neo-paganism in any sense but a sort of comical, let's just do this for fun kind of thing. But apparently people do believe it. And yeah, they do use the rune system, the Futhark rune system. A lot of, within this neo-paganism movement, you get a lot of, unfortunately, sort of white nationalism, although that's not in its entirety. You get all kinds of variations, but a lot of it is sort of steeped in this white nationalist stuff. I know I'll be offending the white nationalists here, but it just sounds such an odd thing, Germanic neo-paganism. In any event, yes, the runes have been resurrected there. Whether they actually believe in the magical portents of Futhark or not, I do not have the answer to that, but there you have it. Now, I hope this video was informative. Obviously not a subject matter of interest to that many people, but I do find it interesting, and Sir Matthew of Lint asked me to do this. So once again, sir, I will thank you for your donation, and enjoy the frosty weather of Scandinavia, though it's still summertime. Take care. Bye-bye.